Okay, off we go. And so last week I took a diversion and discussed the Tyree Nichols death, the question about the anti-Black police violence in the United States and how that reflects stereotypes and in particular self-stereotyping. And then we connected that just a little to some of the themes I want to be talking about as we continue our discussion, which I'm now going to rejoin, of justice, care, ethics, and the lifespan revolution. And one of the big takeaways from my research on this topic is that self stereotyping around age stereotypes is particularly hard to dislodge because those stereotypes are ones we develop and internalize and reinforce over most of our lives. And by the time they come to apply to us, right, we have discriminated against our future selves for so long that it's very hard to dislodge the stereotype. And so there was a relation between what we spoke about last week and what we'll be continuing to speak about for coming weeks. But now I want to get firmly back into this topic. So very quickly, just to reprise what it is that I'm focused on overall, is the lifespan revolution. The fact that human beings have already begun to live about 4 times as long as we did for most of human history. The fact that the average person coming of age in the United States today is more likely than not to live to 100 years old. The fact that, therefore, the distribution of persons across age strata, which for most of human history has looked like a pyramid, which by the time you reach your 60s and 70s, there's a smaller portion of the population. By the time you reach your 80s, it's such a small portion of the population that it's negligible. Now instead looks like a rectangle, which is to say, all the way up through the 80s, there are similar numbers of people as there are for lower age stratas. The number of children and the number of 70-year-olds in our country is roughly equivalent, that it's only once you get up into the late 80s and 90s or the 100s that you begin to get the old narrowing that used to go across the entire age distribution. So the demographics of our societies are changing, our lifespans are changing, but our society, our ways of thinking, our medical system, our forms of the provision and distribution of care have not caught up with the changes that we're in the midst of. This is a revolution. It is a fundamental change in the nature of our society. We need to change our culture, change our institutions, change our attitudes to take into account the lifespan revolution. The foundational work that I'm doing in this course draws on 4 thinkers, and we are about halfway through this. We left off talking about Daniel Levitin's Successful Aging, and before that we had treated Louise Aronson's Elderhood. Aronson is a geriatrician, a medical doctor, and one of the things that she helps us to think through is aging in the body. And Levitin is a neuroscientist, and what he helps us to understand is the process of aging in the brain as the right physical substrate of the mind, of how we think, of how our memory operates, of our intelligence. And let me just briefly offer what I think is a very rough synthesis of what I would take away from Aronson and Levitin if I had to put it in a kind of simple single statement. It would be aging is heterogeneous. And with excuses for the jargon, What I'm saying is it's not homogeneous. It's not all one thing. It's not experienced by everyone in the same way. And so then let me differentiate two ways in which it is heterogeneous. On the one hand, those who go through the process of aging do it in different ways and at different rates. Becca Levy tells a couple stories in her book, Breaking the Age Code. I'll get to her in a moment, of people who do extraordinary things in their 80s and 90s physically. A nun who, in her early 80s, decides to take up the triathlon, right? So she's running a marathon, riding a bicycle for 100 miles, and swimming for 3 miles. And she does the full thing, and she does it for a decade, right? And she actually gets very good at it. And not that that is typical, but what it points out is that different bodies age in different ways, right? Some of us may, in fact, be quite physically vigorous into our 80s and 90s. And there are other stories like that. There are stories of great artistic accomplishment, important scientific breakthroughs that people have in their 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, right? And so the nature of aging is not the same for everyone. The second aspect of it being heterogeneous is that it is actually internally differentiated for each of us in different ways. Some of us will lose muscle mass more or less quickly. We'll find our joints suffer more wear and tear and begin to deteriorate more or less quickly. And then, similarly, looking at this from the neuroanatomical point of view, it turns out, as we were discussing a couple weeks ago, that memory is not one thing, but in fact, rather diverse neurological processes, different kinds of memory that are located in different regions and circuits of the brain, and that aspects of memory do decline, and other aspects, in fact, strengthen. Aspects of intelligence decline, other aspects strengthen as you get older, right? And so the idea that this is a straight down path that everybody is on at more or less the same pace is doubly wrong. We're on it in different paces, and we have different aspects of decline, but also of actual development continuing, right? New learning, new neurological circuitry, neuroplasticity continuing through our 70s, 80s, and 90s, right? And so if Aronson and Levitin help us to understand the physiological, biological, neurological nature of aging and its heterogeneity, Ellen Langer and Becca Levy help us to understand the psychology of aging. And I'm not going to preview too much yet. We'll get into this, but they help us to see the way in which our experience of aging is mediated by our understanding of aging and ourselves as aged. And so that the way in which we conceptualize the process of aging actually influences the way in which we experience it, not just psychologically, but also biologically. And so that's to help see some of the relevance of the corrective that Aronson and Levitin offer. So to just get the core idea from Aronson's book, for most of human history, there have been two main acts or stages in a human lifespan: childhood and adulthood. What is different today is that The second act is not the end of the play. There's a third act. And Levinson suggests we refer to it as elderhood. She thinks old has too many negative stereotypes associated with it. So she wants a new term. And she points out in this diagram that for many of us, it constitutes roughly a third of our life, and that for many of us, it may be as much as half of our adult life. So to not treat it as distinct, to not judge it by its own standards, to not have the right kind of goals and ambitions associated with this phase of life is doing ourselves a disservice. It's neglecting a extremely important segment of the 21st century human lifespan. And similarly, she suggests, yes, it is the case that as we enter elderhood, we become less independent, not that we're ever perfectly independent, more dependent on care from others because of the way our society is built and because of processes of aging that are taking place in the body and the mind. But having said that, children are also highly dependent upon others. And just as you wouldn't expect a 10 or 12-year-old to completely fend for themselves, you shouldn't expect an 80 or 90-year-old to completely fend for themselves. But that doesn't mean that either the child or the elder is deficient, just that our expectations on them are age appropriate. And that in particular, just as in caring for the 10 or 12-year-old, you try to prepare them for future agency, in caring for the 80 or 90-year-old, you should be doing everything you can to maintain their agency, their autonomy, their self of control, their sense of self-control or control over their lives. So that's a very quick synthesis of what I think we take away from Aronson's work. Levitin's work starts us off with this diagram, and I think this is wonderful and at the same time so counterintuitive. If we measure well-being across ages for multiple societies, I believe it's 70 societies are taken into account in this research, we find a very uniform pattern, which is that people feel pretty good when they're young adults. And then as the responsibilities of adulthood and middle age begin to weigh upon you, your sense of well-being goes down as you are sacrificing your present satisfaction to your future accomplishments. Your well-being is inhibited. And then as you leave those middle age phases, your well-being goes up consistently, decade after decade, from your 50s through your 80s. And at least the way in which this research is presented, it doesn't tail back down, right? One of the things that would be interesting to see is if we could extend this further, would it continue going up, or would it actually level off? But having said that, right, the idea that the age at which people report maximum well-being or satisfaction with life is 82, right? The fact that the 80s are the happiest decade in subjective reports of well-being doesn't, right, generalize, doesn't mean that everybody is absolutely happy in their 80s, doesn't mean that we have to take subjective reports as the absolute standard for judging well-being. But there's something that really challenges, I think, our stereotypes about the experience of aging. This does not have to be a period of decline, a period of loss, a period in which we nostalgically look back on and wish for earlier days. So one of the questions that Levitin then raises is, how do we account for this? And this is still quite general information, but one thing to note is that human beings are not just extending their lifespans, we are extending our health spans. We are staying healthier longer. Doesn't mean you're perfectly healthy. I don't think I've mentioned this to you before, but I have back issues. I have relatively frequent spasms. They're not very much fun when I go through them. They're a product of spending too much time with books and on a computer and having my hands in the positions necessary to mark in books and type on the keyboard. Um, I don't consider that a major limitation on my health, and I don't think that that's right interfering with my health span. I am still fully functional and doing everything I want to do, right? And so when we talk about the health span, we're talking not about being completely free of ailment, right? That nice work if you can get it, but very few of us are. What we're talking about instead is being able to manage your work life, your housework, your typical daily activities. And as you can see, right, from the 50s through the 70s, very high rates of maintaining full functional health. Actually, up to 90% of people, it appears, maybe that's 85% of people, all the way through the end of their 70s. It does begin to go down in your 80s and into your mid 80s. But what this shows is, among other things, that in a sense, and then this is Aronson's argument again, that we should be concerned not just with the number of years that we live, the quantity, but the quality of those years. And that if we can extend health through this elongated lifespan, we can also then increase the health span. And that is, in fact, what we are doing these days. So Levitin is a neuroscientist, has done really interesting research on how the brain processes music and what it does to the brain to play music, to make music, to listen to music. He himself is a musician. He was a tenured professor at McGill University, one of the leading research institutes in North America. And he then, as he's gotten older, he started his academic career later. He didn't go to college until his late 30s. He didn't get a PhD. I said late 30s, I'm sorry, late 20s. He didn't get a PhD until his mid 30s. He was at that time taught by, mentored by, supervised by a generation of neuroscientists at McGill who had done trailblazing work, all of whom were in their 70s, and all of whom, at least at the time of his writing of this book a couple of years ago, are still active in the field in their 80s and 90s, right? And so one of the things I think is interesting is to ask, where do the people I'm drawing on get the idea of studying aging and thinking about it differently from? Clearly, his experience suggested that. Last time we talked about Levitin, I pointed out that he thinks that one of the things that neuroscience teaches is that the brain is continuously developing. He refers to it as a kind of Disney-esque creature that keeps moving out and continuing to incorporate new things. 70s, 80s, 90s, new neurological connections, new neurons, new learning is occurring. Neuroplasticity is not limited to the first 20 years of life. It is a lifelong process of the brain continuing to grow and develop. He also suggests that as important as the architecture of the brain is, so too is lifetime experience and environmental factors. And the good news in this is we can't alter our genetics, but we can alter our experiences and our environments. And he gives us a fair bit of evidence and advice for how to do this. And in particular, he suggests one of the environmental factors or experiential factors that's so important to lifelong brain health is personality. That personality is both variable, and this is obvious, right? We know people who are more outgoing, less outgoing, people who have a broader range of emotional sensitivity, or people who have a narrower range of emotional sensitivity, people who are open to new experiences or threatened by new experiences. And not only that, but that different ways of structuring your personality, different personality types, if you will, influence how you age. And then finally, that personality can be altered by the individual, him or herself, using your own will. And so uh, Levitin calls this volitional personality change. And so one of the things to then think through is, if as you age, your personality changes in ways that you don't like, you don't have to merely go where the aging process is taking you. There are things you can do to work on yourself. Last time we talked about this, we were talking in particular about memory, and I'm not going to fully rehash all of this with you, but I will point out, right, that we tend to use this single word, but from a neuroscientific perspective, it conflates many different things, sensory memory. And so one of the things that you may be aware of is that people with very advanced dementia and Alzheimer's still remember how to walk, still remember how to feed themselves with a fork, to chew, etc., to swallow. And so that there are aspects of memory that are built into your experience of the world that seem very primitive in their integration into the brain circuitry. Short-term memory, right? You know, what's 27 times 32? You have to remember the numbers you've carried in order to be able to do that in your head. And it turns out that our short-term memory really is not evolved for the demands that we put on it in the modern world. That's true at 20 and 40 and 60, but we tend to get a little worse at it as we get into our 70s, 80s, 90s. But much more importantly, Levitin suggests to be much more frustrated about it, right? And that is because we worry that this is a sense of decline, when in fact it's typically just a indication of the limitation of short-term memory as such. And then long-term memory, as you can see, there's a whole array of different aspects of long-term memory. The payoff to a neuroscientific understanding of the different kinds of memory is to be able to ask and answer the question: does memory uniformly decline as a normal part of the aging of the brain? And the short answer to that is no. Right. And to be as clear as possible, Levitin suggests that 1 in 6 adults suffer some form of minor cognitive impairment as they age, right? And so that just means a slowing of certain aspects of cognition. A lot of this has to do with neurological processes, with the fact, for instance, that dopamine reception on neurons declines as the neurons age. And dopamine, as you may know, is the pleasure receptor, but it's also important, for instance, to concentration. And so there are aspects of cognitive decline that come with aging. It's also the fact that a little bit more than 1 in 10 people who reach their 80s suffer from dementia, including Alzheimer's, right? And that's a much more serious form of cognitive impairment. But I think the other thing to notice then is that 5, 6 of us suffer no cognitive impairment. Nearly 90% of us don't suffer from dementia into our 80s and 90s. What we do suffer from is not a generalized decline, but specific kinds of decline that are accompanied by actual improvement in other aspects of memory. So, episodic memory, memories of your own life, tend to become sometimes more distorted with age, in part because memory is very creative, very constructive. There's a lot of editing that goes on, and the editing doesn't just filter out irrelevant stuff, it adds new stuff, right? So you can do these tests where you show somebody a picture of a birthday party, and then you ask them after the fact, was there a cake? Was there a pin the tail on the donkey game? And they will think about it for a second and say yes. And when you interview them, they'll tell you where in the picture the cake was, where in the picture the donkey was when it wasn't there. Right. And that's not us lying or fabricating or being fabulous. That's the way in which the brain works. The brain constructs an image of the world, a theory of the other person, an account of events on incomplete information, and supplies for us in an unconscious way things that we aren't aware of in order to complete the picture. Each time we remember something, some more of that occurs, some more of that occurs, some more of that occurs, so that you get perhaps a highly stylized, perhaps a not particularly reliable memory of some of the events of your life as you get older, simply because you are remembering not for the first time or the second time, but for the 20th time or the 50th time. Semantic memory, memory of basic contentful knowledge, gets better as we age, not worse, right? And so I won't continue down this path much longer, but the important thing to note is that memory is not getting uniformly worse. Aspects of it are getting better, and there are things we can do to compensate for the aspects of memory that are getting worse, using the aspects of memory that are getting better, or the attributes of personality that could assist us. And so Levitin emphasizes conscientiousness as one personality trait that is extremely important. And so if you're like me, and twice a day you're running around trying to figure out where you left your phone, right? Levitin says there's a simple solution to this. Have two or three places in your house where you always put your phone. Don't just put it down at random. My problem is I've got a black phone case and a black desk, and I put it down on the black desk or the blue blanket, and I can't see it there anymore. It kind of blends in, right? So be conscientious, but also recognize that this is not uniform decline. This is selective decline, complemented and potentially compensated for by growing strengths and other things. And then there are things that we can do to improve our memory. And I'm going to start with a story that's actually told by Becky Levy, Becca Levy, in her book, Breaking the Age Code. And so she talks about actually a professor at Wesleyan who, in his late 70s, decided to challenge his memory. And the challenge he took on was memorizing Milton's Paradise Lost, right? Just a little book, and to be able to give a public recitation of the entire epic poem from memory, and he did it. Right. And the thing that's really interesting to me, this is a man, a theater professor, who, as a young man, had wanted to break into acting. And the only parts that he could get, the professional support he could get, was working for a deaf theater troupe. And so he learned to sign. And they did pantomime, they did stuff with signing, they also did stuff that was regular acting. And eventually he put that behind him and moved on to other stuff. But what he discovered was that it was much easier to remember lines, long monologues, etc., if at the same time he was memorizing them, he also did the monologue in sign language. And this is something that I think illuminates what Levitin is saying, which is memory is not located one place in the brain, it's located in multiple places in the brain. And if you are active, if you are simultaneously thinking, learning words, and using your hands to represent that knowledge, it turns out you lay down multiple memory tracks simultaneously, and that helps you to remember the words when you go back to try to retrieve them. And by the way, the same thing is true for reading a book with a pencil or pen in your hand, underlining, marking in the margins, talking with a friend about it after you've read it. So, as he puts it at one point, the key to remembering things is to get involved in them actively, right? Don't just listen. And I feel like I've been talking for a while. Please put your comments in, or unmute yourself and ask whenever you want. This is the way that learning occurs best across all age groups. Actively using information, generating and regenerating it, engages more areas of the brain than merely listening. And this is a sure way to remember it. The second idea: avoid the public narrative of despair and stigmatization for cognitive impairment. And this one is a hard one. And it comes back to this idea that among the things that our memory sustains is our fundamental memory and sense of self. Who am I? I am the person who can tell the story of my life better than anyone else because I was there and I remember it all, right? And if my memory starts to fade, do I lose who I am? And that can cause a sense of panic, a sense of stress. And that turns out is actually really bad for cognition and memory. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment. But the I'm Still Here Foundation, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this or not. It's an Alzheimer's rights advocacy organization. I like the name of the organization, right? Which is to say, yes, you may suffer, and nobody wants this. It's, I think, one of the main dreads associated with the aging process. You may suffer Alzheimer's. You may suffer from dementia, but that doesn't mean that you stop being a person or you stop being the person you are, right? And so avoid thinking because there's one memory lapse, one senior moment that, oh no, the sky is falling. And then this is the passage, right, that I was referring to before, right? The brain is constantly, as he puts it, oozing in various directions. It is apparently able to respond to injury with striking functional reorganization and can at times actually think itself into a new anatomical configuration. So one of the things I find so fascinating about this, um, when somebody loses their eyesight, right? And there are these really interesting experiments that are being done where they put a kind of sonar into the person's skull, right? So that the soundscape created by the physical space around them is then transmitted into a sensory pattern on the scalp. It's a bit, I guess, equivalent to what a bat might have in terms of sonar, right? You're getting impression of the physical space around you based on how sound bounces off of it, and then that's being played out on your scalp, right? In terms of kinds of stimulation by electrodes. What is interesting is that people begin to develop, if, in these experiments, a picture of the world around them. They begin to be able to navigate the world around them. And then when we study their brains, they use functional magnetic resonance imaging to see what's going on in their brains, it turns out that the visual cortex of the brain, where, right, the stimulus from the eyes and the optic nerve eventually goes to create the image of the world that we see around us, is being stimulated now instead by touch, by haptic sensation from the scalp, right? So the brain has literally reorganized itself. And so again, there may be decline as we age, but that doesn't mean that it can't be compensated for. Neuroplasticity is there all the way through the aging process. With apologies that this is a little skewed the way it copied, a similar kind of decompositional analysis. Don't think it's all one thing. Look at memory; it's actually 7 different things, and understanding each of them is important to understanding what happens to the brain when we age. Something similar is true of intelligence. It's multifaceted, right? There are multiple intelligence. Howard Gardner, a psychologist at the Harvard Education School, is the one who did the pioneering writing and research on this. We do have a problem, which is that people have devised tests for certain kinds of intelligence, IQ tests, intelligence quotient tests, originally on the mistaken idea. I think it's fair now to say that this is just a mistake, that there was only one general kind of intelligence, and asking people to do a bunch of math and logic and word problems got at that kind of intelligence, right? There's a big debate going on in our society right now about the use of the SATs, the LSATs, and other standardized tests, that they really capture only a narrow aspect of intelligence, that they're not very predictive of actual academic or professional or lifetime success. And that is because other aspects of intelligence may ultimately be more important, even in an academic context, but certainly in the context of a full life. So this is then the list, right? Musical rhythmic intelligence as a distinct aspect of intelligence. Levitin, perhaps understandably, lists that as the #1 form of intelligence. Visual spatial intelligence, right? And so they're just some people who are very good at knowing what direction to go and how to find their way on the path back to where they started, and some of us who are not. Verbal linguistic intelligence and logical mathematical intelligence, I think, are more familiar because these are the standard forms of intelligence tested by IQ and other aptitude tests. But body kinesthetic intelligence as well. I don't know about you. I've got a few friends who are just incredibly gifted in terms of their capacity to use their bodies to do things that the rest of us would fall flat on our faces if we tried to do. Interpersonal social intelligence, this is sometimes also referred to as emotional intelligence, especially when intrapersonal intelligence is added. And so we've got EQ, or emotional quotient, in addition to IQ, or intelligence quotient. Spiritual intelligence. So William James, one of the founders of psychology, was deeply interested in the idea that some people are spiritual savants. They just have a greater understanding of the spiritual dimensions of the human experience than the rest of us, moral intelligence, naturalistic intelligence, creative intelligence. So I hope the idea is plausible now, that it's not just one thing, intelligence. And it does turn out that, for instance, logical mathematical intelligence is a kind of intelligence that if you don't maintain it, right? And this is the use it or lose it paradigm, right? Which is to say, if you were really good at math when you were in school, but then you go into a career that doesn't require you to use math very much or at all, you're only balancing your checkbook or something like that, then probably your mathematical intelligence, your underlying mathematical capacity is going to decline over time. But other aspects, particularly intra and interpersonal, spiritual and moral intelligence, do tend to improve with age. And so again, the image here, I think, is very important. What do we mean by wisdom? Well, we don't mean that the person concerned is necessarily going to be able to sit down and do the long division problem in their head in a flash, right? But that they may be able to guide us in making difficult life decisions and to help us resolve the moral dilemma we seem to be facing. Why is that? Right? And that is because these aspects of intelligence actually improve over time, get stronger with more frequent needs to use this aspect of the mind and brain over age, right? As we age over time. And this then gets us to the core idea, which is that we can successfully manage our aging process, treat it as a period of growth, a period of ambition, at least at the cognitive level. Um, and to do that, Levitin recommends that we follow a series of steps. And I want to be as clear as possible. This is very individualized. And as we're about to get into with the psychology, the world needs to meet us halfway. It's not going to be sufficient to simply do this stuff if there's age discrimination all around us, if the built world doesn't allow us to maintain our agency and functionality. But at least in the moment we're at right now, doing this stuff helps. And so the core advice that Levitin offers, he boils down to an acronym: COACH. And so curiosity, try to learn on a continuous basis. Openness, try new things, right? Learning more and more and more about the context of the First Anglo-Dutch War in the 17th century may feed your curiosity, but it also narrows the regions of the brain you're using, the aspects of the intelligence that you have, that you're developing. Be open to new things, new ideas. Learn to paint, learn to dance, learn a new instrument, see a new city, meet new people, do different things as you get older. Associations, and here it's simple, right? Maintain a good social circle. Easier said than done often, but maintain a diverse social circle. Don't become isolated. Conscientiousness, I've already spoken about, but recognize that there are going to be aspects of your physical and mental capabilities that are going to decline, and then figure out how to compensate for them and do your best to maintain and preserve what you have. And then finally, health. And here it's really simple: exercise 30 minutes a day and get your heart pumping. Go to the doctor on a regular basis and the thing that Levitin points out is, well, yes, there are good physical reasons to get 30 minutes of exercise a day for heart health and body health, but it turns out it's really good for the brain. It's good for stress release. It's good for being able to sleep at night. It's actually good for brain circulation, right? And so it's not just physical, it's also to do with brain health, to get exercise. So he boils this down. This is the appendix to the book. I figured I'd share this with you to 10 recommendations. Don't retire. And I don't think he means don't stop working an arduous job you don't like, right? The example we were talking about from the New York Times, perhaps somewhat slanted reporting on Japan, but don't stop being engaged with meaningful work. That doesn't have to mean paid, remunerated work, right? It could be volunteer work, but have something that keeps you engaged in the world. Look forward, don't look back, right? Reminiscing doesn't promote health. And I think the key idea here is, and we'll talk more about this with Levitin and also Langer, the will to live, right? That if there's something that you need to get done today, makes it less likely that you're going to want to take a nap or just veg out in front of the television. If it's part of a project that it's going to take you a couple years to accomplish, even better. My father, many of you know, 87 years old, not in great health, has cancer. He says he wants to live long enough to see the 2024 election and to work for the Democrats. I hope that when that's done, he'll want to live for 2026 and 2028, right? But have something that is in the future that you are committed to and that keeps you focused on not just what you had in the past, but what you hope to accomplish going forward. Exercise, embrace a moderated lifestyle with healthy practices, try to avoid junk food, highly processed food, not too much alcohol. Keep your social circle exciting and new. Spend time with people younger than you. I think those two very much go together. And again, maybe easier said than done, but there are ways, I think, to do this individually. And then there are ways we as a society need to be thinking about how to structure our social spaces, our built world to allow this. See your doctor regularly, but not obsessively. Don't think of yourself as old. And we'll get into this, but the idea that your self-conception mediates your experience of yourself. And so you I don't think want to think of yourself as young if you're in your 80s or your 90s, but maybe as an elder, as somebody who has wisdom and creativity and things to share and accomplish and contribute. Appreciate your cognitive strengths. He points to pattern recognition, crystallized intelligence, wisdom, and accumulated knowledge as being things that continue to improve 70s, 80s, 90s, 100s. These are things that are getting stronger, and that although there may be things that are getting weaker, rather than beating yourself up over that, right? And this is a general life lesson. Focus on what you're good at and integrate that into the way you think of yourself. And then finally, promote cognitive health through experiential learning. And this goes back to that example of the guy who memorized Milton by not just studying the text, but by actually signing it. Do new things that do new things with yourself, your body. Learn to dance if you don't dance. Learn to play a new instrument. Travel. Go places you don't tend to go. If you're a city person, go to nature. If you're a nature person, go to a new area in the city, right? And in this way, right, maintain your curiosity and your openness. So I'm going to stop for a moment. I know I've been just talking today, and I've got plenty more to say. But as you've just seen from Levitin, right, we need to be in dialogue about this. Who wants to start us out? If there's more time, I'll move on. But first things first, I want to hear what you have to say. Go ahead and unmute yourself whenever you want to. Anybody want to start us out?
Okay. I want to thank you for this, David. I just had my 4 months inoculation in the right eye, and I have been informed that it doesn't stop the progress of the disease, it just stops the bleeding. Right. But I did ask my new physician whether anything was done or being done for macular degeneration. And she said they're working on it. So I played the game. Will there be any news in 10 years? No. In 6 years? No. In 3 years? No. Tomorrow? No. But we can hope. But right now, it is an amazing experience how much I have to rely on other sensory capacities to be seeing again. I actually wish to see, and so I see. It's amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. I'm sorry to hear. I'm just muting you because it was echoing of the decline in the macular degeneration. It puts me in mind of my undergraduate mentor who had juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, apparently at the time the worst case ever recorded. And he was told, I think at the age of 25, that he would live a decade at most. He was in his mid to late 40s when he taught me. He was in his late 60s when I spoke at his retirement party. And part of what happened there is breakthroughs in medicine in the nick of time, right? 3 or 4 different generations of new medicine arrested his autoimmune condition. And so these breakthroughs do happen, but yes, the idea of when they don't compensate, and the brain is an amazingly powerful instrument, and our willpower is amazingly powerful as well. I'll say one more thing. And this is kind of, again, previewing what's to come. But Ellen Langer, whose work I want to talk with you about next, and she's a big advocate of mindfulness in medicine. And one of the things she suggests is that we treat our doctors as collaborators. And she points out, and I'll get into this in more detail, but that the doctors like to present themselves as if they are completely authoritative in their realm of knowledge. But it turns out, if you study medicine, there's actually so much controversy that there are very few things that a doctor really should claim are settled medical science, which doesn't mean you should substitute your own judgment for your doctor's judgment, but it does mean you should try to get second opinions, and that you should be actively engaged in questioning your doctor to try to figure out as much as you can on your own to be active in managing your own healthcare. I found that to be interesting and relevant, perhaps, to what you're doing with Flossie. Anyone else? I think I heard somebody else unmute themselves. Yeah, go ahead, John. But you're still muted. You do have to unmute yourself. There you go.
Okay. About reminiscing not being a creative thing to do, well, yes and no. I think if lots of people start writing memoirs and things like that. And if it's just a sort of emotional thing, that's when, but you also learn and discover new things. I mean, I've been doing quite a bit of that, as well as translating letters that were written 50 years ago. I mean, there's a great deal that happens when you apply your present mind to past events.
Yeah. And let me say one more thing about this, Joan, and thank you for the thought. I think what Levitin is saying is don't live your whole life as an exercise in nostalgia. Have some things you're looking forward to. That may include writing a memoir that helps you to organize your story of your life, right? And maybe make it something you can pass down to another generation or to other people who might find it illuminating. I'd say another thing about this, and this is not from Levitin, this is from other reading in social psychology and my own experience. When you're around old friends and talking about things you did a long time ago, you become a slightly different version of yourself. I think this is a fundamental and interesting thing about human psychology. We are relational creatures, right? And so how you relate to your life partner versus how you relate to your child versus how you relate to your boss versus how you relate to your oldest friend that you had all those escapades with, there's actually a slightly different self that is presented in each of those interactions, right? And so I also would say, meet new people, do new things, keep in touch with the old people, and remember the old things too. Strikes me as some kind of balance there is necessary. David, I think you've got your hand up, but you're still muted.
Yeah. We're sharing a room with Flossie today, so Barbara, Flossie, and I are all here in the same room. But I wanted to speak for a moment about Gardner's multiple intelligences, which I believe to be a very useful heuristic. It needs to be said, however, that the empirical foundations of it are a little shaky. It's not altogether clear that these dispositions or intelligences are independent of one another. People who are good at one of the things are probably good at 3 or 4 or 5 of them, and the like, so that there's some issues with that. That said, I do think it's a useful heuristic for thinking about how we approach, interact with, and come to know the world in which we live. And I think that it's, remember, these are not learning styles. These are not, if you're good at it, it doesn't mean that these are the only ways that you can learn. And I think a goal of well-roundedness and thinking of ourselves as having some level of competence with respect to all of them, from sort of a timid acquaintanceship to some kind of almost like apprenticeship to ownership. And then finally, if you really get good at one or another of these, you can even be critical about that disposition. So think of them as a continuum of competence or ownership of this way of interacting with the world. And I think that's the best way to think of it, but still useful heuristic for thinking about how you approach, interact with, and come to know life.
And so I'll say, quickly, kind of mute. You're getting an echo, and feel free to unmute yourself to respond. One of the things I take away from Gardner's work is, so maybe they're independent from each other, maybe they're not independent from each other, but that our traditional conception of intelligence has been very narrow, right? And so we need to fill it out and that a fair bit of what succeeds in life doesn't have to do with your ability to do word problems or math problems, right? And so that may help you to get into the good university, but it's not why you're going to succeed. And so that test, and I could speak more about this, there's really good literature that shows the single largest predictor of how well you're going to do on a standardized test for college admissions is the wealth of your family, right? And that's because they give you the time and the resources and probably the educational opportunities to get good at it. So even if Gardner's work is nothing but a useful heuristic, it's useful in that regard. But then Levitin, who comes at it from a slightly different direction than Gardner, right? Gardner's not a neuroscientist. Levitin points out that there does seem to be some trade-off within the brain between these different capacities. And so I don't know enough to independently evaluate this, but he suggests that perhaps at the very high ends of exceptional cognitive functionality are people we might call polymaths. And he points to Da Vinci as perhaps, you know, the model of someone who actually is very good at multiple kinds of intelligence. But then he says that the typical genius actually is somebody who's good, very good at one aspect of this. And he points to Einstein, right, who was notorious for getting lost on Princeton's campus year after year, day after day, because he spent all his time on mathematical, logical, physical stuff and had, as a result, attenuated spatial physical intelligence. That's Levitin's response. I'm not going to try to arbitrate it, but I think it's worthwhile noting that he does seem to be committed to a view of the brain in which sometimes strength in one aspect leads to weaknesses in others. Now, the final thing to add is that most of us are neither Da Vinci nor Einstein, and that he thinks that most humans are actually pretty good at all of these things. And the thing to notice is that some of them decline, but some of them get stronger as we age. Do you want to come back on that, David?
Well, no, I just want to agree with you, first of all, on the lack of really useful information from standardized tests. Standardized tests are best at predicting how you will score on other standardized tests. They're not very good at predicting how you will perform out in the real world, you know, on when those tasks get enacted with all the contextual surround in which we use them in daily life. So that I'm in complete agreement with. I just want to, you know, and I also agree that there are people who are, you know, savants in particular areas, no question about that. But even so, as you said at the end, most of us tend to be sort of, you know, average on a lot of these things, and that being well-rounded, empirical evidence notwithstanding, is probably a reasonable, you know, goal to aspire to.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Anybody else with a question or a thought for today?
Yeah, I'm wondering about, I think I've asked about this before. Are there some people, I can remember songs from 100 years ago. No, I wasn't born then. But anyway, where I can't remember other things from, you know, 2 days ago. Is that a peculiarity, or is that common?
That's very common. And I will tell you, so some of you know that my mother has quite advanced Alzheimer's. And so at this point, she really can't speak very much anymore at all. But I'll give you the concrete example. I know she likes the song Bicycle Built for Two, right? So I played that for her the other day, and we were singing together. And I forget the mistake I made, but she remembered the lyrics better than I did, right? And Levitin has studied this. I don't know if you saw the slide, but Levitin's first book was called Your Brain on Music. And he points out that there are really peculiar things about the brain and music. So memory is very rarely photographic or perfect. But one thing we seem to have perfect memory for is the pitch of songs that we know well, right? So we immediately know when it's being played in the wrong key, right? And we just hear that and know it. And it's not like other kinds of memories where we can be very easily fooled or just don't remember it very well. And it does seem that there's something about putting music and words together that really causes things to take hold in memory. I'm not sure I can say more than that. I have not read The Brain on Music. I read a little bit about what's called the Levitin effect in neuroscience, which is that pitch perfect thing. But yes, there does seem to be something different going on with music. And no, you're not unique, Bonnie. This is something that appears to be ubiquitous among us.
David?
Yes, go ahead. Is this Doris?
Yes, it is.
Hi.
Hi.
Been a while. Go ahead.
Well, I just want to make a comment to something that David said. There's nothing wrong about being average.
Yes, it turns out for some strange reason, most of us are average, right?
You know, I realized that term when I took my son to his first grade class and went to an evaluation, and the teacher said, he's average. You know, you don't think of your first son as being average, going, you've coddled and you've nursed this kid and you want, he's average? What do you mean he's average? But
well, he's not average to you, right? And then there's the wonderful introduction to Lake Wobegon Days, which is not on the air anymore. But right, the town where all children are above average, obviously impossible. Yeah,
well,
thank you for that, Doris. Go ahead.
oh, well, we all want to work above average, but we are mostly average.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
and we age averagely. I'm pretty sure of that, right?
I'm not sure about that because it seems that there's such diversity within the aging process. But sure, you could do averages. I just don't know how meaningful they would be. And so you know, averages just statistically work best for classes of things that have similar distributions of behavior. If aging is not one of those things, averages may not be very illuminating. But I did want to say one more thing, Doris, which is probably as we get older, we get better at accepting that we're average. I suspect that's the case. That might be part of wisdom, right?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And great being with you guys again. And we'll now transition into thinking about the psychological side of this topic next week, unless something big pops up in the news, and then we'll go in that direction instead. Take care, everybody, and be well. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.